Somewhere in a genetics lab, researchers pulled together DNA samples from people living on 6 different continents. They collected saliva and blood from Poland, from Ethiopia, from India, from Morocco, from Yemen, and from the United States. Then they ran these samples against the genetic code of nearly every major population on Earth. What came back did not just answer a question about one group of people. It changed how scientists think about memory itself, the kind of memory that is not written down, not spoken, not passed through stories, but stored quietly inside human cells. For years, geneticists had been circling one question, testing it slowly, checking their numbers over and over before saying anything in public. The question sounds simple enough to ask a child, yet it took some of the most advanced tools in modern science to even attempt an answer. Who are the Jewish people biologically? Not through religion, not through culture, not through nationality or politics, through chromosomes, through the raw code sitting inside every cell. Where did this population actually begin? And after 2,000 years spread across Europe, North Africa, Central Asia, India, and the highlands of Ethiopia, what did that scattering actually do to their bodies at the molecular level? Teams from Harvard, Hebrew University, Columbia, and research centers across Europe took on this question together. And what they found forced many of them to rethink assumptions they had walked into the project already believing. Start with scale, because the numbers alone are strange. Today, there are roughly 16.5 million Jewish people on the planet. Out of more than 8 billion humans alive, that is about 0.2%. A sliver, a rounding error in the total population of the species. Yet this small group has lived inside nearly every major civilization in recorded history. They were welcomed, then expelled, then attacked, then rebuilt themselves, expelled again, and rebuilt again over and over across a timeline so long that most modern countries look brand new by comparison. Empires that once seemed permanent, Rome, Byzantium, the Ottomans, all eventually collapsed. Jewish communities kept going, and they carried something forward the entire time without realizing it, their genetic code. This is not randomness. This looks a lot more like biological endurance. When researchers first started comparing Jewish genomes seriously in the early 2000s, most expected a simple result. Populations usually start resembling their neighbors after enough time passes in one place. Common sense said that Ashkenazi Jews, whose families lived across Central and Eastern Europe for roughly 1,000 years, should genetically resemble Germans, Poles, or Russians by now. Moroccan Jews should look like Berbers. Persian Jews should look Iranian. Ethiopian Jews should match other Ethiopians. That is usually how it works. Time, marriage, and geography blur populations together until the original source becomes almost invisible. That is not what happened here. Studies looking at the 22 non-sex chromosomes, the ones carrying most human genetic information, found strong genetic closeness between Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews, all tracing back to a shared Middle Eastern origin, with local mixing layered on top depending on where each group ended up living. Think about what that actually means. Communities separated by oceans, by completely different languages, by different foods, by prayer customs that developed independently for centuries, still point back to the same starting place once you look past the surface. The genetic evidence lines up with the historical claim that Jewish populations trace back to the ancient Levant, the strip of land that is now Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, sitting right where Africa, Asia, and Europe meet. No matter where these communities eventually landed, that signal in the DNA keeps pointing home. Here's the part that surprised researchers the most. Despite hundreds of years living among European, North African, and Asian populations, and despite picking up local genetic markers along the way, a shared biological thread still runs through Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi lineages. Genetic data shows that most Jewish communities around the world are closer to each other and closer to other Levantine groups like Druze and Palestinians than they are to the populations they lived beside for centuries. 1,000 years surrounded by European neighbors left a smaller genetic mark than 3,000 years of shared ancestry in a homeland most of these people never physically visited. Read that twice, because it goes against what we normally expect from human migration. 1,000 years of daily contact left less of a fingerprint than 3 millennia of distant ancestral connection. And the deeper researchers dug, the stranger the story got, especially inside the Ashkenazi branch, which today makes up roughly half of all living Jewish people worldwide. According to one detailed genetic model, the ancestors of Ashkenazi Jews passed through 3 major population bottlenecks. The first happened somewhere between 85,000 and 91,000 years ago, tied to the broader human migration out of Africa, something shared by nearly everyone alive today. The second happened around 21,000 years ago among an early European founding group. But the third bottleneck is the one that changes everything. Sometime during the Middle Ages, the entire Ashkenazi population dropped to somewhere under 350 people, 350 individuals. That is not really a population in any normal sense. That is closer to a large extended family. Fewer people than you would find in a single school building. And from that tiny surviving group, the modern Ashkenazi Jewish population, now numbering in the millions, eventually grew. Research published through Nature Communications backs this up, showing that Ashkenazi Jews descend from a population that was roughly an even blend of Middle Eastern and European ancestry, tracing back to somewhere between 330 and 350 founding individuals. Because the founding group was so small, nearly every Ashkenazi Jewish person alive today is, at minimum, something like a 30th cousin to every other Ashkenazi Jewish person alive today, not as a figure of speech, as a literal, traceable genetic fact. This bottleneck is estimated to have happened somewhere around 600 to 800 years ago, followed by an explosive population recovery, growing somewhere between 16 and 53% per generation once conditions allowed it. This was the era of the Black Death, the Crusades, and violent attacks on Jewish communities across the Rhineland. Historical trauma became biological structure. Here is where things get genuinely important for people living right now, not just historically interesting. When you take a population of only a few hundred people and grow it into millions, whatever genetic traits those founders happen to carry do not get diluted the way they would in a larger starting group. Instead, they get amplified, concentrated, locked in. Scientists call this the founder effect, and in the Ashkenazi population, it had a direct and measurable impact. It sharply raised the frequency of certain inherited diseases. The math is specific. About 1 in 27 Ashkenazi Jews carries the Tay-Sachs mutation compared to roughly 1 in 250 in the general population. Around 1 in 10 carries a mutation linked to Gaucher disease compared to about 1 in 100 among non-Jewish populations. In total, researchers have identified around 16 inherited conditions that show up at unusually high rates in Ashkenazi communities. Several of them serious neurological disorders, including Tay-Sachs, Canavan disease, and familial dysautonomia. But there is an unexpected twist buried inside this data. 4 of these conditions, Tay-Sachs, Gaucher disease, mucolipidosis type 4, and Niemann-Pick disease, all involve problems with how the body stores a specific kind of fat molecule called sphingolipids. That is not a coincidence researchers expected. Some scientists now think that carrying just 1 copy of these mutations, rather than 2, may have offered some resistance to tuberculosis, a disease that devastated European cities for centuries. If having a single copy gave people a survival edge against an epidemic that was killing large portions of the population, natural selection would have quietly kept that mutation circulating, even while the disease itself caused suffering in anyone who inherited 2 copies. Evolution does not care about comfort. It only cares about what keeps a population alive long enough to reproduce. Then there is BRCA. Roughly 1 in 40 people of Ashkenazi Jewish descent carries a BRCA gene mutation, compared to about 1 in 250 in the general population. These mutations sharply raise the risk of breast, ovarian, prostate, and pancreatic cancers. This is not ancient history sitting in a textbook. It is active medical practice today. The National Health Service in England now runs a specific Jewish BRCA testing program, offering genetic screening to anyone with at least 1 Jewish grandparent, because of the documented, elevated chance of carrying an Ashkenazi founder mutation. A population bottleneck from the medieval period is still influencing cancer screening decisions in hospitals right now. Move away from the Ashkenazi story, and each remaining branch of the Jewish world tells its own distinct chapter. Sephardic Jews, descended from communities expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492, under the joint rule of Ferdinand and Isabella, carry a genetic profile that sits between their ancient Middle Eastern roots and centuries spent moving through the Mediterranean world. In detailed genetic mapping, Sephardic populations cluster separately from both Ashkenazi and North African groups, landing almost exactly in between, which fits their history of dispersing through the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, the Netherlands, and eventually the Americas. Their Levantine genetic signal is still there, just softened by centuries of Mediterranean mixing. Then come the Mizrahi Jews, communities that, in a real sense, never left the region at all. Jews of Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Syria, Egypt, and Morocco trace an unbroken presence in those lands back to the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. Because they stayed in the Middle East and North Africa, Mizrahi Jews show the strongest surviving genetic connection to the ancient Levant of any Jewish group alive today. In a sense, their genomes may be the closest living approximation available to what the ancient Israelite population actually looked like genetically. Roughly 4.5 million Mizrahi Jews exist today, descended from communities that stayed close to their origin point rather than migrating into Europe, meaning they never experienced the medieval bottleneck that shaped the Ashkenazi genetic story so dramatically. Then the research reaches cases that genuinely stretch what people assume Jewish identity even means, starting with Ethiopian Jews known as Beta Israel. This community lived in the Ethiopian highlands for centuries, possibly longer, practicing a form of Judaism that developed in near total isolation from the rest of the Jewish world, with no Talmud and no rabbinic tradition. Essentially, a Judaism frozen at an earlier stage of development. Genetically, Beta Israel shares far more with neighboring East African populations than with Ashkenazi or Sephardic communities. Their maternal and paternal lineages cluster with other Ethiopian groups, not with the broader Jewish genetic cluster. Indian Jewish communities complicate the picture even further. The Bene Israel of Mumbai and the Cochin Jews of Kerala have practiced Judaism on the Indian subcontinent for centuries, with oral traditions describing origins tracing back to shipwrecked merchants from ancient Israel. Genetically, these communities show mostly South Asian maternal ancestry, with some shared Jewish genetic markers layered on top. In other words, their DNA looks largely Indian, while their prayer books remain Hebrew, preserved across roughly 2,000 years with almost no contact with the wider Jewish world. Sit with that for a second. The global Jewish population includes groups that are genetically African, genetically South Asian, genetically and even split of European and Middle Eastern, and groups that remain almost entirely ancient Levantine. And yet, across all of these dramatically different genetic profiles, researchers were still able to find shared markers connecting them. Genetic analysis consistently shows that Jewish communities, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi alike, share more DNA with each other than with their non-Jewish neighbors. Long, uninterrupted stretches of matching DNA, called identity by descent segments, point to centuries of marrying within the community rather than outside it. One of the most striking pieces of evidence came from a Harvard Medical School study published in the journal Cell that went a step further than comparing living people. Researchers pulled ancient DNA directly from teeth found in a medieval Jewish cemetery in Erfurt, Germany. This let them read genetic history straight from the source, rather than reconstructing it from modern descendants. The results revealed two genetically distinct subgroups buried in that same cemetery, one carrying more Middle Eastern ancestry, likely linked to Jews originally from Western Germany, and another carrying more Central and Eastern European ancestry. Two communities, genetically different, buried side by side, likely attending the same synagogue and speaking the same language, yet carrying measurably different ancestral backgrounds. The modern Ashkenazi population appears to have formed from a blending of these two groups, absorbing very little additional outside genetic material over the roughly 6 centuries that followed. Researchers even found some of the same disease-linked mutations present in the modern population inside these medieval remains, confirming that the population really did pass through an extremely narrow founding bottleneck. Mitochondrial DNA analysis added another striking detail. Roughly 1/3 of the individuals buried there traced their maternal line back to a single common female ancestor. Then came a finding that seemed to belong to an entirely different story. A peer-reviewed study analyzing mitochondrial DNA across more than 23,000 individuals from East Asian populations and Jewish communities found that a small number of Ashkenazi individuals carried mitochondrial lineages belonging to Eastern Eurasian haplogroups, meaning Ashkenazi Jews received a small but real genetic contribution from East Asia. Researchers estimate this lineage split off roughly 14,800 years ago, a timeline that lines up with historical trade connections. The ancient Silk Road, the network of trade routes linking the Mediterranean world to China, apparently carried more than goods and ideas. It carried people, and traces of that contact are still visible in the Ashkenazi genome today, more than 1,000 years later. Broader research keeps reinforcing the same underlying pattern. A landmark 2012 study led by Harry Oster at Albert Einstein College of Medicine analyzed genetic material from over 500 Jewish donors across 15 different communities, comparing them against more than 100 non-Jewish donors. It found that Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews were genetically closer to one another than to the populations they had lived among for generations, and that all three groups carried Middle Eastern ancestry, with regional mixing layered differently depending on where each community settled. That same research estimated that Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews split apart from each other roughly 2,500 years ago, right around the time of the Babylonian exile. A political catastrophe, the conquest of ancient Judea by Babylon and the forced displacement of its people, appears to have sent two branches of Jewish life in different directions, one moving east into what is now Iraq and Iran, the other eventually moving west into Europe. 2,500 years later, that ancient split is still visible in the genome. This research also speaks directly to an ongoing historical debate. Some critics have long argued that Jewish people are not genetically connected to the Middle East at all, framing them instead as converts or unrelated groups that simply adopted the religion. The genetic evidence does not support that claim. A comprehensive study from 2020 found that modern Jewish populations, alongside other Levantine groups, derive more than half of their ancestry from populations closely related to the ancient Canaanites, pointing toward a continuous biological connection to the region stretching back more than 3,000 years. There is a genuinely interesting question buried inside all of this. How does a population hold onto this level of genetic continuity across 2,500 years of dispersal, when most small minority groups eventually get genetically absorbed into whatever larger population surrounds them? Part of the answer comes down to social structure combined with historical circumstance, a combination that is almost unmatched anywhere else in human history. Marrying within the community helped preserve genetic boundaries generation after generation. And persecution, in a strange and unintended way, reinforced that same pattern. When surrounding societies made intermarriage illegal, dangerous, or socially devastating, they were, without meaning to, helping preserve a distinct genetic lineage. The very forces aimed at erasing this population ended up helping preserve what made it biologically traceable. Then, there is the sheer scale of demographic recovery. The Ashkenazi community grew from roughly 50,000 people at the start of the 15th century to about 5 million people by the start of the 19th century. 50,000 to 5 million in 400 years. That is not ordinary population growth. That is an explosive rebound from an extremely small starting base, a population compressed by medieval violence, and then expanding rapidly once conditions allowed it, carrying every founder effect genetic trait along with it, and amplifying those traits faster, simply because the overall population itself was expanding so quickly. One more detail deserves attention. A meaningful number of people carrying detectable Ashkenazi Jewish genetic ancestry have no idea it is there. Among nearly 2,000 people who tested positive for a BRCA mutation and provided information about their ancestry, roughly 21% did not report any Jewish background at all. Yet more than half of that group showed detectable Ashkenazi Jewish genetic ancestry once tested. In other words, the genetic signal survives even after the cultural identity attached to it has been lost, forgotten, or intentionally hidden across generations of conversion and assimilation. The biology holds onto information the family history no longer remembers. It is just as important to be clear about what this research does not show. It does not support any idea of genetic superiority or inferiority. It does not fit neatly into any framework built around racial hierarchy. What it actually reveals is a population shaped by an unusual, sometimes brutal combination of catastrophe and continuity. The bottlenecks were real. The persecution was real. The forced isolation left biological consequences, some clearly harmful in the form of inherited disease, others possibly protective in ways researchers are still studying. None of it lines up with the crude ideas that extremists on different sides have tried to attach to Jewish genetics over the years. The real science is more specific, more complicated, and honestly more human than any of those simplified narratives. What all of this ultimately points to is something bigger than one population. It shows how biology itself can function as a kind of historical record. It shows how a tiny founding group can leave a genetic signature that echoes across 30 or more generations. It shows that human beings carry, quite literally inside their cells, the memory of migrations, catastrophes, separations, and survival stories that happened long before they were born. In some sense, every person alive carries a version of this record. What makes the Jewish population stand out is not that this record exists, since every population carries one. What stands out is that the specific historical circumstances made this particular record unusually clear, unusually distinct, and unusually possible to trace using modern tools. The Erfurt research found that the modern Ashkenazi genome looks like a near-even blend of the two medieval subgroups uncovered in that cemetery, with roughly 60% tracing to the group carrying stronger Middle Eastern ancestry, and about 40% tracing to the group with stronger Central European ancestry. Two communities, separated at the time by geography and possibly social status, eventually merged into a single shared genetic identity, one now carried by millions of people across the United States, Israel, Europe, and beyond, most of whom have never heard of Erfurt, never set foot in Germany, and have no conscious connection to the medieval city where these genetic threads were originally woven together. A more recent study from 2025, led by researchers Livne and Skorecki, found that fewer than 15% of individuals in their Ashkenazi sample carried maternal DNA lineages that entered the population after its original founding, confirming with the newest available tools that the maternal genetic core of the Ashkenazi population remains ancient, remarkably stable, and predominantly Middle Eastern in origin. So the original question, who are Jewish people biologically, turns out to have an answer that is both precise and still unfolding. Genetically, the majority trace back to an ancient Levantine population that scattered across the world, adapted to wherever it landed, survived conditions that would have erased most other small populations, and left behind a biological record durable enough to still be readable 3,000 years later, sitting quietly in the saliva of someone who has never left New York or Moscow or Buenos Aires. But there is a question the science cannot fully answer yet. What does it mean for the growing number of people who discover through a commercial DNA test that they carry Ashkenazi genetic markers without ever knowing they had Jewish ancestry at all? What does it mean for families in North Africa, Spain, and Portugal descended from ancestors forced to convert under the Inquisition 5 centuries ago, who now watch Middle Eastern ancestry appear in their results out of nowhere? What does it mean for the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, whose genetics read as predominantly African, yet who have practiced Judaism for so long that scholars still debate whether their roots trace back to ancient Israelites or to later African converts? What does it mean for the Bene Israel of India, whose DNA reads as South Asian while their prayer book remains Hebrew? And what does any of this mean for the larger question of how identity actually works? Is a people defined by culture, by religion, by shared history, or by something sitting quietly in a sequence of genetic code that no one chooses and no one can change? The DNA gives an extraordinarily precise window into the past. It does not hand us a simple answer about meaning. And that gap between what the genome can tell us and what we still do not know how to do with that information is exactly where the most important questions are still waiting to be asked. What researchers found was not something dark or alarming. It was something far more layered, far more resilient, and far more historically rich than most people expected going in. And the further genetic tools advance, the clearer it becomes that everything we thought we understood about identity, ancestry, and biological continuity was only the opening chapter. The rest of the story is still being written, one genome at a time.